The morning the widow gave away her last coin dawned thin and colorless, the kind of morning that felt as though the sun itself was unsure whether it wished to rise. And Sarah Whitlow noticed that before she noticed anything else. Because when you have buried a husband, buried a child, and buried hope in shallow graves behind a weather-beaten cabin, you begin to pay attention to small things, like how the sky hesitates, like how the wind pauses before it blows, like how the world seems to hold its breath as if waiting to see whether you will finally break. And Sarah had not broken yet, though many had expected her to, though perhaps even she herself had expected it in the long nights when the fire burned low on the walls, whispered memories she did not invite. She rose from her narrow bed before the rooster crowed, wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and moved through the cabin with the careful quiet of someone who knows how fragile peace can be, stopping first at the small wooden box beneath the window where she kept what little she owned, opening it slowly as if the contents might vanish if startled. And inside lay three things of value: a folded scrap of cloth that had once belonged to her daughter, a tarnished wedding ring she could not bring herself to sell, and one single silver coin, worn smooth from passing through many hands, its edges rounded by years of desperation, charity, greed, and survival. And Sarah lifted that coin and held it between her fingers, feeling its weight, knowing exactly what it could buy: half a sack of flour if she was lucky, a few nails, maybe a strip of salted pork if the storekeeper was feeling generous. But she also knew what it could not buy, and that was sleep without hunger clawing at her insides, warmth enough to silence the memories, or the return of the man who had promised her a lifetime and given her 7 short years before the earth took him. And she closed her fist around the coin and whispered a prayer she had whispered every morning since becoming a widow, not for riches or rescue, but simply for the strength to face another day, without turning bitter, without turning hard, because bitterness was easier than hunger and hardness was easier than hope, and she feared those things more than she feared starvation. She dressed in her plain black dress, the one she had worn since the funeral and never replaced, brushed her hair into a tight bun, and stepped outside into the pale dust of the frontier town, where buildings leaned like tired men and the road stretched away toward the train platform that served as the town's thin connection to the rest of the world. And as she walked, she noticed how empty the streets were, how even the dogs seemed reluctant to stir, and she wondered whether the town sensed something she did not, whether fate itself had saddled up somewhere beyond the horizon and was riding her way. The platform came into view, flanked by 2 long, silent rail cars that loomed like sleeping beasts, their metal sides cold and indifferent. And Sarah paused there, not because she needed the train, but because the platform had become a place where people passed through. And passing people sometimes carried news, sometimes carried work, and sometimes carried trouble. And as she stood there, she saw him, seated on the edge of the platform, with his shoulders slumped and his hat pulled low, a stranger whose clothes were worn to softness and whose boots had known too many miles, a man who looked as though the road had used him hard and then cast him aside when it grew bored. And Sarah felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the quiet war between caution and compassion, because she had learned the hard way that not every outstretched hand deserved trust. Yet she also knew that if she had survived these past years, it was only because someone, somewhere, had once chosen to be kind to her when it made no sense, when it cost them something they could ill afford to lose. The stranger looked up as she approached, his eyes a tired gray, sharp despite the exhaustion, and for a moment they studied each other, 2 souls measuring the weight of the world in the other's gaze. And he did not beg, did not speak, did not even extend his hand at first. And that silence moved her more than words ever could, because desperation that still holds onto dignity is a rare thing. And she reached into her pocket and felt the coin again, felt the cold truth of it, felt the hunger it represented, felt the nights ahead it might soften. And she hesitated long enough for reason to make its case, telling her she owed this man nothing, telling her kindness did not keep bellies full, telling her the world did not reward sacrifice. And yet her hand moved anyway, driven by something deeper than logic, something her husband had once called her curse and her blessing both. And she let the coin fall into the stranger's open palm, the soft clink of metal sounding louder than it should have in the still air, and the man's fingers closed around it as though afraid it might vanish, his breath hitching just slightly. And when he looked up again, there was something different in his eyes, something like disbelief mixed with gratitude mixed with a promise. Sarah could not yet understand. And he spoke then, his voice rough but steady, thanking her not with flowery words but with a simple nod and a quiet, "You didn't have to," to which she replied, "Maybe not. But I did." And with that she turned and walked away before regret could catch her, before hunger could argue its case again, before the fear of tomorrow could undo the goodness of today, unaware that in that single moment, in that single choice, she had set into motion events that would bring riders to her door by morning, would stir old debts buried in blood and dust, and would test whether her compassion was a weakness the world could exploit or a strength that could change everything. And if you're the kind of person who believes that small choices don't matter, that one coin can't change a life, then I ask you to keep listening. Because stories like this exist to remind us that sometimes the smallest acts echo the loudest. And if you want to hear how this single moment unfolds into danger, courage, and redemption, make sure you stay with this story and subscribe to the channel. Because what comes next will test the widow, the stranger, and the very meaning of mercy on the unforgiving frontier. Dawn did not arrive gently at Sarah Whitlow's cabin. It came like a warning, a pale gray light bleeding through the cracks in the walls, stirring her from a sleep so shallow it hardly deserved the name. And before she even opened her eyes, she sensed it. That old instinct sharpened by loss and loneliness, the feeling that the world had shifted while she rested, that something had moved closer, something heavy and deliberate, and she lay still, for a long moment, listening to the quiet that was no longer quiet at all, because beneath the birdsong and the sigh of wind through dry grass there was another sound, faint but unmistakable, the dull rhythm of hooves striking earth, many hooves spaced with purpose, circling rather than passing through. And her heart tightened not in panic but in recognition, for the frontier taught its lessons brutally, and one of them was this: riders at dawn never brought good news. She rose slowly, pulling on her boots and shawl, her movements calm only because fear had long ago exhausted its power over her. And she crossed the cabin to the window, easing the curtain aside just enough to see, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs, for there they were, half a dozen men on horseback, maybe more beyond the trees, spread in a loose ring around her land like wolves testing a fence, their silhouettes dark against the whitening sky, rifles slung, coats long, hats low, the kind of men who carried violence as casually as other men carried prayer. And Sarah's first thought was not for herself but for the stranger, for the man she had given her last coin to only hours before, because the timing was too sharp, too cruel to be coincidence, and the memory of his eyes returned to her, that strange mixture of weariness and resolve, and she wondered what she had invited into her life with that small act of mercy. A knock came then, heavy and deliberate, not the polite knock of a neighbor, but the kind meant to announce authority, and Sarah stepped back from the window and went to the door, pausing only long enough to square her shoulders and whisper her husband's name, like a talisman, because whatever waited on the other side, she would meet it standing. And when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a man whose presence seemed to swallow the morning light. Broad-shouldered, scarred, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes cold and assessing, and behind him the riders shifted in their saddles, leather creaking, weapons gleaming, and the man tipped his hat just enough to mock courtesy and said, her name as though tasting it, Sarah Whitlow, and she felt a chill not because he knew who she was, but because he spoke it with certainty, as if she had been expected, as if this visit had been planned long before she ever stood on that train platform. And she answered simply, "That's me," refusing to ask what they wanted, because the asking would grant them power. And the man smiled thinly and told her they were looking for someone, a traveler, a man who had passed through town the day before. And Sarah's mind raced even as her face remained still, because lies on the frontier were as dangerous as bullets, and she did not yet know which truth would keep her alive. And she said she saw many travelers, which was true, and the man leaned closer, his voice dropping, describing the stranger with unsettling precision, the worn boots, the gray eyes, the way he carried himself like someone who had once been important and learned the cost of it. And Sarah felt the weight of her choice pressing down on her chest, because in that moment she understood that the coin she had given away had not been small at all. It had been a key, and she had used it to unlock a door she did not know existed. She told them she did not know where the man had gone, and the leader studied her, searching for cracks, for fear, for greed. And finding none, he straightened and laughed softly, a sound without humor, and said that was a shame, because the man owed them something. Something valuable, something taken long ago. And debts like that did not fade with time. And as he spoke, Sarah realized with a clarity that surprised her that these men were not law, not bounty hunters in the honest sense, but something older and darker, men who enforced their own justice, who believed the world was divided into those who took and those who were taken from. And the leader told her that kindness could be dangerous, that the frontier had little patience for women who involved themselves in men's affairs. And Sarah felt anger rise then, hot and sudden, not because she feared them, but because she recognized the lie beneath his words, the lie that compassion was weakness. And she met his gaze and said quietly that if they had business with the man, they should take it up with him. And the leader's eyes narrowed, because courage unsettles bullies more than defiance ever could. And he warned her that harboring a fugitive carried consequences, and she replied that she harbored no one, which again was true, because she had given a coin, not shelter, mercy, not allegiance. And for a long moment, the riders did nothing. The air stretched tight as wire, and then from the edge of the clearing came a sound that changed everything, the sound of another horse approaching at speed. And the riders turned as one, hands moving toward weapons, and Sarah stepped forward despite herself, her heart pounding because she knew before she saw him who it would be. And when the stranger rode into view, his posture straight, his eyes clear, his presence commanding in a way that made the other men shift uneasily, Sarah understood that the man she had helped was not merely a traveler down on his luck, but someone who had once been powerful enough to earn enemies like these. And as he dismounted and faced the ring of riders, placing himself deliberately between them and Sarah's cabin, she felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, something dangerously close to hope. And if you're listening to this story and you think this is where it becomes simple, where the stranger draws a gun and saves the widow, then I urge you to stay, because the frontier never gives without taking. And what unfolds next will demand more than bullets, more than bravery. And if you want to hear how mercy is repaid, how courage is tested, and how a poor widow's last coin reshapes the fate of everyone standing in that clearing, make sure you subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us, because the next part brings the truth of the stranger, the rider's ultimatum, and a choice that will cost Sarah more than she ever imagined.